The room was dead silent. You could hear a pin drop in the plush office of Thorne and Associates. 3 siblings sat in front of the massive mahogany desk. 2 of them were smiling, already calculating the millions they were about to spend on sports cars and vacations. The third, Flora, was weeping, not for the money, but for the father she had just buried. Then, the lawyer, Mr. Silas Thorne, cleared his throat and removed his glasses. He looked at the greedy siblings and said, "You believe you have won." But Arthur Vance had one final secret. What happened next didn't just shock the family, it changed history. This is the story of how a disowned daughter walked out with everything. The rain over Seattle didn't wash away the grief. It only made the black umbrellas of the mourners look like a gathering of crows. It was October 14th, 2023, the day the legendary real estate tycoon Arthur Vance was lowered into the ground. Arthur had been a titan of industry. His name was on skyscrapers from Chicago to London. But here, in the private cemetery of the Vance family estate, a sprawling, Gothic manor known as Blackwood, the atmosphere was suffocating. Flora Vance stood apart from the others. At 26, she looked pale, her dark hair plastered to her forehead by the drizzle. She wore a simple black coat, one she had owned for 5 years. She hadn't slept in weeks. For the last 2 years, while Arthur battled the aggressive cancer that finally consumed him, Flora had been his nurse, his confidant, and his only true companion. She had changed his sheets, managed his morphine, and read to him when his eyes grew too weak to focus. Standing 10 feet away, under a canopy held by a chauffeur, were her half-siblings, Amal and Sarah. They were the children of Arthur's second wife, a socialite who had divorced him a decade ago. Amal, 32, checked his Rolex Submariner every 30 seconds. He was whispering into a Bluetooth earpiece, likely closing a deal or cancelling a dinner reservation. Sarah, 29, was dabbing at dry eyes with a silk handkerchief that cost more than Flora's entire outfit. "Can we speed this up?" Amal muttered, loud enough for the priest to hear. "It's freezing, and the reading is at 3. Flora flinched. "Amal, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He's not even in the ground yet." Amal turned his cold, blue gaze toward her. "Save the theatrics, Ellie. We all know why you stayed in this drafty old house for 2 years cleaning up his mess. You're playing the long game. But don't think Dad didn't see through it." "I stayed because he was my father," Flora said, her hands trembling. Sarah laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "You stayed because you have no career, no husband, and no prospects. You were his glorified maid. And today, we finally settled the bill." The service ended abruptly. Amal and Sarah didn't throw dirt onto the coffin. They simply turned and walked toward the waiting limousine. Flora remained. She knelt in the mud, placing a single white rose on the wet wood. "I love you, Dad," she choked out. "I hope you finally have peace." As she stood up, she saw a figure watching her from the porch of the main house. It was Mr. Silas Thorne, Arthur's attorney and oldest friend. He was a man of few words, known in the legal world as the Iron Vault. He had served the Vance family for 40 years. His face was unreadable, carved from granite. But as Flora caught his eye, he gave a slow, solemn nod. Flora felt a pit form in her stomach. She didn't care about the money. She truly didn't. But she knew her siblings. They were sharks who smelled blood in the water. Arthur had been a hard man, difficult to love and impossible to please. In his final months, the dementia had set in, causing him to lash out, screaming at Flora, calling her by her mother's name, accusing her of stealing from him. Amal and Sarah hadn't visited once during those months. Not once. But they had called the lawyers daily. Flora walked back to the house, the mud clinging to her heels. She entered the grand foyer, where the staff, Mrs. Higgins, the housekeeper, and old Thomas the gardener stood in a line, looking anxious. "Miss Flora," Mrs. Higgins said, her eyes red. "Mr. Amal has already ordered us to start cataloguing the silver." Flora closed her eyes. "He hasn't even heard the will yet." "He says it's a formality," Mrs. Higgins whispered, clutching Flora's hand. He says you'll be out of here by tonight." Flora straightened her spine. She had spent 2 years fighting death to keep her father alive. She could spend one afternoon fighting her siblings to preserve his dignity. "Let's go to the library," Flora said softly. "It's time." The library of Blackwood Manor was a masterpiece of mahogany and leather, smelling of old paper and cigar smoke. It was Arthur's sanctuary. Now it felt like a courtroom. Mr. Silas Thorne sat behind Arthur's massive desk. He had opened a thick leather briefcase and placed a single sealed envelope in the center of the green blotter. Amal sat in the wingback chair to the right, legs crossed, swirling a glass of Arthur's 50-year-old scotch. Sarah sat next to him, scrolling through Instagram on her phone. Flora sat on a small wooden chair near the back, feeling like an intruder in her own home. "Shall we begin?" Amal asked, checking his watch again. "I have a flight to Aspen at 8. Silas Thorne looked over his spectacles. "This is the last will and testament of Arthur James Vance, executed on August 1st, 2023, 2 months before his passing." Amal froze. "Wait, that's a mistake. The will was written in 2019. I have a copy." "Mr. Vance updated his will multiple times in his final year," Thorne said calmly. "This is the binding document." Sarah sat up straighter. "Updated?" He was out of his mind with meds in August. He couldn't sign anything. "I assure you," Thorne's voice dropped an octave. "Mr. Vance was of sound mind and body when this document was notarized. I was present, as were 2 independent witnesses and a neurologist." The room went deadly quiet. The rain lashed against the tall windows. Thorne broke the seal. The sound of tearing paper seemed to echo like a gunshot. "To my loyal staff," Thorne began, "Mrs. Martha Higgins is to receive the sum of $250,000 to ensure her retirement is comfortable. To Thomas O'Malley, my gardener, the sum of $150,000. From the hallway, a muffled sob was heard. Amal rolled his eyes. Fine. Throw crumbs to the help. Get to the assets, the portfolio, the real estate." Thorne continued. "To the charities listed in Section B, the Seattle Children's Hospital and the Cancer Research Institute, I bequeath 20% of my liquid assets." 20%? Sarah shrieked. "That's millions. He's giving away our money to strangers." "His money, Sarah," Flora spoke up from the back. "It was his money." "Shut up, nursemaid," Amal snapped. Thorne ignored the outburst. "Now, to the division of the primary estate." He looked at Amal. "To my son, Amal Vance. You have always had a sharp mind for business and a sharper hunger for status. You believed that being the eldest male entitled you to the kingdom. However, over the last 5 years, I have watched you use the Vance name to bully competitors and leverage debt. You see people as numbers." Amal's face went red. "Is this a lecture or a will?" "Therefore," Thorne read, "to Amal, I leave my collection of vintage automobiles, valued at approximately $4 million. And I leave you the advice to learn humility before you lose everything." Amal stood up, knocking his scotch over. "Cars. Just the cars. The portfolio alone is worth $500 million. You can't do this." "Sit down, Mr. Vance," Thorn commanded. The authority in his voice was absolute. Thorn turned to Sarah. To my daughter, Sarah. You have treated this family like a limitless credit card. You visited me only when you needed a signature on a check. To you, I leave the Vance jewelry collection, including your mother's diamonds, valued at $3 million. May they bring you the attention you so desperately crave. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her throat. $3 million? That's it? I can't live on $3 million. My mortgage is $50,000 a month. That leaves the remainder of the estate, Thorn said, looking toward the back of the room. Amal and Sarah turned slowly to look at Flora. Their eyes were wide with a mixture of shock and pure, unadulterated hatred. The house, Amal hissed. The stocks, the international holdings. He gave it all to her? To the mouse? Flora felt lightheaded. She hadn't expected this. She didn't want the empire. She just wanted to keep the house, to keep her father's memory alive. Thorn looked at Flora. His expression softened for a fraction of a second before hardening again. He looked back at the paper. To my daughter, Flora, Thorn read, and then he paused. The silence stretched for 10 seconds. Read it, Amal screamed. Thorn took a deep breath. To my daughter, Flora, you were the only one who stayed. You were the only one who cared. You sacrificed your youth to wipe the brow of a dying old man. Flora began to cry silently. But, Thorn continued, I am a businessman, Flora, and I fear that you are too soft for this world. You have a good heart, but a good heart is a liability in the Vance Empire. If I leave you the company, Amal and Sarah will tear you apart in court within a year. They will destroy you. Flora's heart stopped. Therefore, Thorn read, his voice heavy, I cannot leave the burden of the Vance Empire to you. It would be a curse, not a gift. Amal and Sarah looked at each other, confused. So, Amal stammered, who gets it? Thorn turned the page. The entirety of the Vance liquid assets, the controlling shares of Vance Global and the Blackwood estate are to be placed into a blind trust, managed by a board of directors, until such time as a worthy heir reveals themselves. A worthy heir? Sarah asked. What does that mean? It means, Thorn said, closing the folder, that none of you get the empire. Not today. This is insane, Amal yelled. Who is the heir, then? Thorn reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small silver flash drive. He placed it on the desk. There is a second clause, Thorn said. A test of character clause. Arthur recorded a video message 3 days before he died. He left specific instructions that this video was only to be played if the family began fighting immediately after the will reading. Thorn looked at the puddle of scotch on the floor and Sarah's angry face. As you have clearly demonstrated, Thorn said dryly, the conditions have been met. He walked over to the large television screen mounted on the wall and plugged in the drive. The screen flickered to life. And there was Arthur Vance. He looked frail, sitting in his hospital bed, breathing with an oxygen tube. But his eyes were sharp. Hello, children. The video, Arthur rasped. If you are watching this, it means you're disappointed. Good. Arthur leaned into the camera. I knew Amal would want the power. I knew Sarah would want the money. And I knew Flora would just want everyone to stop fighting. On the screen, Arthur coughed, a painful, rattling sound. So I have set up a game, a final test. Scattered across this estate and the city are clues. But the key to the entire fortune lies in the hands of the person I trusted most in this world. Amal looked at Thorn. You. On the screen, Arthur shook his head, as if he could hear them. No, not the lawyer. The person who holds the key, Arthur said, smiling weakly, is the one person, None of you have looked in the eye for 20 years. The screen went black. The room was silent. Who? Sarah whispered. Who is he talking about? Flora looked around the room. She looked at the lawyer. Then her eyes drifted to the open door of the library. Standing there, holding a tray of tea that no one had asked for, was Mrs. Higgins, the housekeeper. She was trembling. Mrs. Higgins? Flora asked softly. The old woman looked up, terror in her eyes. I have a letter, Miss Flora. Mr. Arthur gave it to me. He said to give it to you when the yelling started. Amal lunged across the room. Give me that letter. He was fast, but Flora was closer. She jumped up, blocking Amal from the elderly woman. Don't you touch her, Flora screamed, a fire igniting in her belly that she didn't know she possessed. Amal stopped, sneering. Hand it over, Ellie. It belongs to the family. I am the family, Flora said, her voice shaking but firm. She took the envelope from Mrs. Higgins's shaking hand. It wasn't a legal document. It was a handwritten note. Flora tore it open. Inside was a single sentence and a set of coordinates. The true wealth isn't in the bank, Ellie. It's where we lost everything. Go to the old mill. The old mill. The place where Flora's mother, Arthur's first wife, had died in a tragic accident 20 years ago. A place Amal and Sarah knew nothing about. Flora looked up at her siblings. I know where to go. Tell us, Amal demanded. No, Flora said. She grabbed her coat. This is my father's last wish, and I'm going to finish it. She ran out of the library, into the foyer, and out into the pouring rain. Get the car, Amal screamed to Sarah. Follow her. The race for the Vance fortune had just begun. Flora's hands were shaking so hard she could barely get the key into the ignition of her beaten-up 2015 sedan. The engine sputtered, coughed, and finally roared to life, just as the front doors of Blackwood Manor flew open. Through the rain-slicked windshield, she saw Amal sprinting down the stone steps, his face twisted in rage. He was shouting something, pointing at her, while Sarah struggled behind him in her heels, almost slipping on the wet pavement. Flora didn't wait. She slammed the car into drive and peeled out of the circular driveway, gravel spraying against the pristine hydrangeas. Sorry, Dad, she whispered, gripping the wheel until her knuckles turned white. But I'm not letting them win. She turned onto the main road, the tires struggling for grip on the asphalt. The old mill was 20 miles away, located on the edge of the Vance property line, deep in the dense pine forests that bordered the estate. It was a place of ghosts. Her mother had died there when Flora was just 6 years old, a structural collapse that had haunted Arthur Vance for the rest of his life. He had boarded it up the day after the funeral and forbade anyone from entering. A bright flash of high-intensity LED headlights flooded her rearview mirror. Flora squinted. It was Amal's black G-Wagon. The massive SUV was built like a tank and had twice the horsepower of Flora's car. He was gaining on her fast. Pick up, Flora muttered, glancing at her phone. She was trying to call Mr. Thorne, the lawyer. This is the voicemail of Silas Thorne. Damn it! She tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. Behind her, Amal blared his horn, a long, aggressive sound that cut through the storm. He was tailgating her, inches from her bumper. He wasn't just following her. He was trying to run her off the road. The road ahead began to twist. They were entering Devil's Elbow, a notorious stretch of winding road that hugged the cliffs overlooking the river. The G-Wagon lunged forward, tapping Flora's bumper. Her car fishtailed, sliding dangerously toward the guardrail. He's crazy, Flora gasped, correcting the steering. He's going to kill us both. Her phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. She risked a glance. Take the logging road. Mile marker 4. Trust me. Thorne. Flora's heart leaped. Thorne was watching. How? Mile marker 4 was coming up in 10 seconds. The logging road was an unpaved, mud-choked track that hadn't been used in years. In her sedan, it was suicide. But on the main road, Amal would eventually ram her into a ditch. She made a split-second decision. "Hold on," she told herself. She slammed on the brakes. Amal, expecting her to speed up, swerved to avoid hitting her, his heavy SUV sliding into the other lane. In that second of separation, Flora yanked the wheel to the right. Her car crashed through a wooden barrier and bounced onto the dirt path. The suspension groaned and mud flew up over the windshield, blinding her for a second. She fought the wheel, the car sliding sideways through the muck, dodging pine trees by inches. Behind her, she saw Amal's brake lights flare red on the main road. He had missed the turn. The G-Wagon was too heavy to make that pivot. He would have to reverse and turn around. She had bought herself 5 minutes. Maybe less. The logging road was a nightmare. Branches whipped against the windows like skeletal fingers. The car bottomed out twice, the sound of metal scraping rock making Flora wince. But she knew this path. Arthur had brought her here once, years ago, on a hike. "The easy road is crowded, Ellie," he had told her. "The hard road is lonely, but it's the only one that leads to the truth." Was this the lesson? Was this the test? Suddenly, the trees broke. The old mill loomed ahead against the grey sky. It was a skeletal beast of rusted iron and rotting wood, sitting on the edge of a raging river. The water level was high, the current violent. Flora skidded to a halt in front of the chained gates. She killed the engine. The silence that rushed back in was heavy. She grabbed a flashlight from her glove box and stepped out into the rain. The padlock on the gate was new. Shiny. "The coordinates," she muttered, checking the note Mrs. Higgins had given her. It didn't point to the main building. It pointed to the supervisor's office, a small concrete block elevated on stilts above the water. She climbed the gate, the metal cold and slick. She dropped to the other side, just as the sound of a powerful engine roared in the distance. Amal was coming. Flora ran toward the office. She had to find whatever was in there before the sharks arrived. The interior of the supervisor's office smelled of mildew and stale oil. Flora's flashlight beam cut through the dust motes dancing in the air. The room was surprisingly empty. Just a metal desk, a broken chair, and a wall of rusted filing cabinets. "Where is it?" Flora panicked. "Dad, don't do this to me!" She ripped open the drawers of the desk. Nothing but mouse droppings and old invoices from the 1990s. She checked the filing cabinets. Empty. Then she heard the screech of tires outside. Doors slamming. "She's in there! I see the light!" Sarah's voice, shrill and angry. "Break the lock!" Amal commanded. Flora froze. She was trapped. There was only one door. She backed up against the far wall, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She scanned the room desperately. The coordinates were specific. 47.6 north, 122. 4. West, elevation 40. She looked down. The floor. Under the desk, the linoleum was peeling. She dropped to her knees and tore the flooring back. There, embedded in the concrete, was a small floor safe. It wasn't old. It was a modern, digital keypad safe. "The code," Flora whispered. "What's the code?" Outside, a heavy rock smashed against the office door. The wood splintered. "Open the door, Flora!" Amal roared. "We know you're in there. You're trespassing on estate property." "I have a right to be here," Flora shouted back, her voice shaking. "You have nothing!" Amal yelled. Another smash. The door hinges groaned. Flora looked at the keypad. 6 digits. She tried her father's birthday. 0812555. Beep, beep, beep. Error. She tried the date of his death. Beep, beep, beep. Error. Red light flashing. System lockout in one attempt. 1 try left. If she failed, it would lock forever. The door burst open. Amal stood in the frame, wet, muddy, and looking like a man possessed. Sarah was behind him, shivering, and holding a tire iron. "Get away from the desk," Amal growled, stepping into the room. "Stay back, Amal," Flora warned, standing over the safe. "You found it," Sarah said, her eyes greedily scanning the floor. "Move, Flora. You don't know the code. Only the family knows the important dates." "I am family," Flora cried out. "You're a nurse!" Amal spat. "Dad didn't tell you the codes. He told me the codes for the Swiss accounts. It's probably the same one." Amal shoved Flora hard. She stumbled back, hitting the wall. Amal dropped to his knees in front of the safe. "Watch and learn," Amal sneered. He punched in a code. 123456. "Really?" Flora asked, despite the fear. "It's the code to the security gate," Amal said. "Beep, beep, beep. System locked." The safe let out a long, low whine. The keypad went block. "You idiot!" Sarah screamed at Amal. "You locked it! Now we have to drill it!" Amal's face went pale. It shouldn't have." Suddenly, the room began to hum. A mechanical sound, coming from the walls. "What did you do?" Flora asked. The heavy steel shutters on the windows slammed down automatically with a deafening clang. Then, the door behind Sarah slammed shut. The electronic lock engaged with a heavy thud. They were sealed in. "Open it!" Amal ran to the door, pulling the handle. It wouldn't budge. "It's a panic room mechanism. Dad installed these in the offices years ago." "We're trapped?" Sarah screeched. "I'm claustrophobic. Amal, get us out!" A static crackle filled the room. There was a speaker mounted in the corner. "If you are hearing this," Arthur Vance's pre-recorded voice filled the small concrete room, "it means someone tried to force their way into the legacy without understanding the key." Amal looked around wildly. "Dad?" "Greed is impatient," the voice continued. "Greed guesses. Greed pushes." Flora stepped forward. She realized something. The safe was a decoy. The lockout triggered the room to seal, but it also triggered the real mechanism. The metal desk in the center of the room clicked. The top drawer, which had been empty moments ago, popped open. A false bottom had released. "The desk," Flora whispered. She reached in. Amal made a move to stop her, but he hesitated. He was afraid of setting off another trap. Flora pulled out a thick, leather-bound journal and a strange, heavy brass key. "That's it!" Sarah yelled. "Give it to me!" "No," Flora said firmly. She opened the journal to the first page. It wasn't a bank ledger. It was a diary. She read the first line aloud. October 14th, 2003. "Today I lost my wife, and today I realized my children are being poisoned by my money. I have to start over." Flora looked up at her siblings. "He wrote this the day Mom died." "Who cares?" Amal snapped. "Is there a check inside? A stock certificate?" "No," Flora said, flipping the page. "It's a confession." She scanned the page, her eyes widening. "Amal," she said, her voice dropping to a horror-struck whisper. "He didn't just blame himself for the accident at the mill. He says he was being blackmailed." "Blackmailed?" Amal frowned. "By who?" Flora held up the book. Taped to the page was a grainy photograph of a younger Arthur Vance, handing a briefcase to a man in a trench coat. "By your grandfather," Flora said, looking at Sarah and Amal. "By your mother's father, Grandpa Sterling." Sarah froze. "That's a lie. Grandpa Sterling was a senator." "He was a crook," Flora read. "He threatened to ruin Arthur's business if he didn't marry his daughter. Your mother. This whole family, a whole fortune. It was built on a crime." The room went silent. The revelation hung in the damp air. "This is the twist," Flora realized. "Dad didn't want us to just inherit the money. He wanted us to know where it came from, so we could decide if we even wanted it. I want it, Amal said coldly, stepping forward. I don't care if it's blood money. Give me the key, Flora. The key doesn't go to a bank, Amal, Flora said, inspecting the brass object. It has an address engraved on it. She held it up to the light of the flashlight. St. Jude's Orphanage, East Wing. An orphanage? Sarah scoffed. Is this a joke? Suddenly the speaker crackled again. You have 10 minutes, Arthur's voice said. The air vents have been sealed. The oxygen in this room is limited. To open the door, you must work together to solve the circuit breaker on the wall. Or you can keep fighting over the book until you all pass out. The choice is yours. The lights on the control panel flickered red. Flora looked at the complicated mess of wires and switches on the wall panel. It was a logic puzzle. Arthur loved logic puzzles. I can't do this alone, Flora said. I need someone to read the schematics while I wire it. She looked at Amal. You're an engineer, Amal. You went to MIT before you dropped out to party. Amal looked at the door, then at the panel. He looked scared. The arrogance was melting away. And Sarah, Flora said, you have smaller hands. You need to reach the fuse behind the grate. Why should we help you? Sarah cried. You have the book. Because if we don't, Flora said, staring them down, the Vance line ends right here in this concrete box. Is that what you want? Amal gritted his teeth. He looked at the book in Flora's hand, then at the panel. Fine, he spat. But once that door opens, the truce is over. Deal, Flora said. They moved toward the wall. For the first time in 20 years, the Vance siblings were working together. But Flora knew, as she twisted the wires, that this was only the beginning. The secret of the blackmail was out, but the key to the orphanage pointed to something far more personal, a secret sibling, or perhaps a hidden life Arthur had never spoken of. As the final wire connected, the door hissed open. Cold, fresh air rushed in. They tumbled out into the rain, gasping. Amal stood up first, wiping mud from his expensive suit. He looked at Flora. He didn't attack her. He just pointed a finger. You got lucky, Ellie. But the orphanage? I know that place. I'm going to get there first. He ran to his G-Wagon. Flora clutched the journal to her chest. She had the map. But she had a feeling the real danger wasn't her brother anymore. It was the people mentioned in the journal, the people who had blackmailed her father. If they knew this book existed, they would come for her. And they wouldn't stop at running her off the road. Flora drove for 20 minutes before her adrenaline crashed. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to pull over. She found herself in the neon-soaked parking lot of Sal's 24-hour diner, a greasy spoon on the outskirts of the city. She needed light. She needed coffee. And she needed to read the journal. She huddled in a back booth, the red vinyl cracked and taped. She ordered a black coffee and opened the leather-bound book again. Her eyes scanned her father's frantic handwriting. The entries from 20 years ago painted a terrifying picture. August 2003. Sterling knows. He knows I plan to divorce his daughter. He sent a man named Cray to my office today. Cray didn't say a word. He just placed a photo of Flora on my desk, a photo of her at her kindergarten playground. The message was clear. If I leave the family, if I take the money, they will hurt her. Flora gasped, covering her mouth. Her father hadn't been distant and cold because he didn't love her. He had pushed her away to make her a smaller target. He had stayed married to the shark-like mother of Amal and Sarah, not out of loyalty, but out of fear for Flora's life. You protected me, she whispered, tears welling up. You suffered in that house for 20 years to keep me safe. She flipped to the last page, written just weeks before his death. I am dying. Cray is still out there. He works for the trust now. The dark money behind the sterling name. They think when I die, the secrets die with me. But this journal is the insurance policy. If Flora finds this, she must know. Do not trust the police. The Sterlings own them. Trust only the lawyer, and find the boy. The boy? Flora frowned. What boy? Mind if I sit? The voice was smooth, like velvet over gravel. Flora looked up. Sliding into the booth opposite her was a man she had never seen before. He was in his 50s, wearing a charcoal grey suit that cost more than the diner itself. He had silver hair, perfectly coiffed, and eyes that looked like dead sharks. He didn't look at the menu. He looked at the journal. "Who are you?" Flora asked, her hand instinctively covering the book. "My name is Mr. Cray," the man said, offering a thin, humourless smile. "I was an associate of your father's father-in-law, Senator Sterling." The blood drained from Flora's face. The man from the journal. The man who had threatened her life when she was 5. "What do you want?" she stammered. "You have something that doesn't belong to you, Miss Vance," Cray said softly. He placed a hand on the table. He wasn't holding a weapon, but the threat was palpable. "That book contains ramblings, lies of a sick old man. It would be embarrassing for the family if it got out." "It's the truth," Flora said, her voice trembling. "You blackmailed him." Cray sighed, as if bored. "Business is complex, Flora. Your brother Amal and your sister Sarah understand business. They are already negotiating with the Sterling Trust to sell the company assets. They are reasonable." "They don't know you killed my mother," Flora blurted out. It was a guess, a wild accusation based on the journal's hint about the accident at the mill. Cray's eyes narrowed. The smile vanished. "That is a very dangerous thing to say," he whispered. "Your siblings are currently tearing up the highway looking for a pot of gold. They don't care about history. But you are a problem." Cray reached into his jacket. "Give me the book, Flora, and the key, and I will let you walk out of here. You can disappear. Go back to being a nurse. Live a long, quiet life." Flora looked around the diner. It was empty, except for a trucker asleep at the counter and a waitress in the back. No one would help her. She looked at the key in her other hand. St. Jude's orphanage. "The boy," Flora realized. "You're afraid I'll find him." Cray's expression twitched. Just a fraction. It was confirmation. "There is no boy," Cray snapped. "Give it to me." He reached across the table, grabbing her wrist. His grip was like iron. Flora didn't think. She reacted. With her free hand, she grabbed her mug of steaming hot coffee and splashed it directly into Cray's face. He roared in pain, releasing her wrist to claw at his burning eyes. "You little witch!" he screamed. Flora grabbed the journal and the key. She slid out of the booth and bolted for the door. "Stop her!" Cray yelled to no one. Flora burst out into the night air. She could hear Cray knocking over tables behind her. She fumbled for her keys, jumped into a car, and slammed the locks down just as Cray slammed his fist against her window. His face was red and blistering, his eyes wild with rage. He pulled a suppressed pistol from his jacket. Flora floored the accelerator. The tires screeched, and she sped out of the lot, ducking as the back window of her car shattered. Thwip, crack. She didn't look back. She drove blindly onto the highway, her heart hammering so hard it hurt. She couldn't go home. She couldn't go to the police. She had to go to the only place left. The address on the key. St. Jude's orphanage was a relic of a bygone era. It was a hulking brick building in the East End, a part of the city the Vance family usually only saw on the news. It was surrounded by a high iron fence. The playground equipment rusted and overgrown with weeds. It was 11 p.m. when Flora pulled her car into the shadows of the alleyway. The back window was gone, the wind whistling through the cabin. She pulled her coat tight and approached the side gate. She expected it to be locked, but as she pushed, it creaked open. The main building was dark, save for a single light in a ground-floor window. Flora approached it and knocked on the glass. Moments later, an elderly woman in a nun's habit opened the side door. She looked wary, squinting into the gloom. "We have no money for donations tonight," the nun said sharply. "Come back in the morning." "Sister," Flora said, holding up her hands. "I'm not here to donate. I'm Flora Vance, Arthur Vance's daughter." The nun froze. Her expression softened instantly, shifting from suspicion to a deep, sad recognition. "Flora," the nun breathed. "He said you might come, but we expected you years ago. You knew him." "Arthur built the new wing of this orphanage," the nun said, opening the door wider. "He came here every Wednesday for 20 years. Please come in, before the damp gets to you." Flora stepped inside. The hallway smelled of floor wax and cabbage. It was poor, but clean. "I have a key," Flora said, holding up the brass object. "It says East Wing." The nun, Sister Margaret, nodded solemnly. "Follow me." They walked through the silent corridors. Flora saw rows of sleeping children in open dormitories. It was a stark contrast to the velvet and silk of Blackwood Manor. "Your father was a good man, Flora," Sister Margaret whispered. "He lived a double life. To the world he was a tycoon. To us he was a savior. He paid for the food, the heating, the books." "Why the East Wing?" Flora asked. "Because that's where he lived," Sister Margaret said. They reached a heavy oak door at the end of the hall. It had no number, just a brass plate that read, "Director's Archive." "The key fits this door," Sister Margaret said. "I cannot enter. Arthur's instructions were strict. Only the bearer of the key." Flora inserted the brass key. The tumblers clicked smoothly, kept oiled, unlike the rest of the building. She pushed the door open and stepped into a small, windowless room. It wasn't an office. It was a shrine to a memory. On the walls were photos, dozens of them. Photos of Arthur, much younger, laughing. And in every photo, he was with a woman Flora didn't recognize. She was beautiful, with dark curls and a kind smile. She wore a waitress uniform in some, a simple dress in others. And then, the photos changed. They showed a baby, a little boy. Arthur was holding the boy, looking happier than Flora had ever seen him. On a small desk in the center of the room sat a single, large red file box. Flora approached it. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside lay a birth certificate and a stack of letters. She picked up the certificate. Name, Gabriel Vance. Date of birth, June 12th, 1999. Father, Arthur Vance. Mother, Maria Santos. "I have a brother," Flora whispered, the shock hitting her like a physical blow. "A younger brother." She picked up the letter on top of the stack. It was addressed to her. "My dearest Flora, if you are reading this, I am gone, and you have met the shadows that haunted me. You know about Sterling and the blackmail. But the blackmail wasn't just about money. It was about Gabriel. Maria was the love of my life. I met her 3 years after your mother died. We were happy. But Sterling found out. He threatened to kill them both if I didn't marry his daughter, the woman who became Amal and Sarah's mother. I did it to save them. I hid Maria and Gabriel here, at St. Jude's. I visited them in secret. But Maria died 5 years ago. And Gabriel? Gabriel has been alone. He is the true heir, Flora. Not because he is a man, but because he is the only one of my children who has never known greed. He has grown up with nothing, yet he volunteers at the shelter every day. He has my heart. The Trust knows he exists. Cray knows. They want to eliminate him to ensure the Sterling bloodline, Amal and Sarah, inherits everything. You must find him. You must protect him. The lawyer, Thorne, has the final documents to transfer the company to Gabriel, but only if you bring Gabriel to him alive. He is not at the orphanage anymore. He is working at the shipyard under the name Gabriel Santos. Go to him. Before Cray does. Flora dropped the letter. Gabriel, a 24-year-old brother working at the docks. He was the billionaire heir, and he didn't even know it. And Cray was coming. Flora turned to run back to the door, but she stopped. Sister Margaret was standing in the doorway, but she wasn't alone. Behind her, illuminated by the hallway light, were two figures, Amal and Sarah. They looked disheveled, wet, and furious. Amal was holding a crowbar. "Well, well," Amal sneered, stepping into the room. "The nun was very helpful once we threatened to buy the building and demolish it." Sarah pushed past the nun, her eyes locking onto the file box. "Is that it?" Sarah demanded. "Is that the money?" "It's not money," Flora said, stepping in front of the desk. "It's a person." "Move, Flora," Amal said, raising the crowbar. "I'm done playing games. Cray called us. He told us you have the journal. He told us to end this." "You're working with Cray," Flora screamed. "He killed Mum. He threatened Dad. He promised us the payout," Amal yelled back, his desperation showing. "Dad disowned us. We have to survive." "He's using you," Flora cried. "There is another brother, a real heir." Amal froze. "What?" "A brother," Flora said. "Gabriel. If Cray finds him, he'll kill him. And if he kills him, do you really think he's going to leave witnesses like us alive?" For a second, doubt flickered in Amal's eyes. But before he could lower the crowbar, the sound of heavy boots echoed down the hallway. Slow, deliberate. "How touching." Cray's voice drifted into the room. A family reunion. Cray appeared in the doorway behind Amal and Sarah, holding a silenced pistol. He shot Sister Margaret, not to kill, but to incapacitate. She fell with a cry, clutching her leg. Amal spun around. "Cray, you said no violence if we tracked her." "Plans change," Cray said, raising the gun toward Flora. "The boy, Gabriel, where is he?" Flora looked at the open window in the small room. It was a tight squeeze, and it led to the alley. She looked at Amal. For the first time in his life, the arrogant businessman looked terrified. He realized he wasn't a partner. He was a loose end. "Amal," Flora said softly. "The coffee pot." Amal looked confused. Then he remembered the story Flora told about the diner. Distraction. Cray stepped forward. "The location. Now." Flora grabbed the heavy red file box. "He's at the shipyard." She lied. "Dock 4. Cray smiled. "Good." He turned the gun toward Amal. "No witnesses." "No!" Flora screamed. She hurled the heavy file box at the light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The room plunged into total darkness. "Run!" Flora screamed. The room exploded into chaos. The muzzle flash of Cray's silenced pistol lit up the darkness like a strobe light, shattering the plaster next to Flora's head. "Get out!" Amal screamed. For the first time in his life, Amal didn't think about his bank account. He threw his shoulder into the darkness, tackling Cray. The two men crashed into the filing cabinet, the metal groaning under their weight. "The window!" Flora grabbed Sarah's arm. Sarah was frozen, hyperventilating. Flora shoved her toward the open sash. "Go, Sarah! Now!" Sarah scrambled through the opening, falling into the muddy alleyway below. Flora followed, dropping onto the wet pavement just as a gunshot blew out the window frame above her. A second later, Amal tumbled out, gasping for air. He had a bloody gash on his forehead, where Cray had pistol-whipped him. "He's coming!" Amal yelled, grabbing Flora's hand. "My car is out back." They sprinted through the rain toward the G-Wagon. Amal fumbled with his keys, his hands slick with blood and rain. They dove inside just as the back door of the orphanage flew open. Cray stood there, silhouetted against the light, raising his weapon. Amal slammed the car into reverse, tires screeching, and spun the heavy SUV around. A bullet pinged off the armored chassis. Amal had paid extra for the bulletproofing, a vanity purchase that just saved their lives. They roared onto the street, leaving the assassin behind. For a mile, there was only the sound of heavy breathing. Then, Sarah broke the silence. "He was going to kill us," she sobbed, curled up in the back seat. "Our own grandfather's fixer. He was going to execute us." "We're liabilities now," Amal said, his voice grim. He looked at Flora in the rear-view mirror. "You said the shipyard. Is that really where he is?" "Yes," Flora said, clutching the birth certificate she had managed to shove into her coat. "Gabriel Santos. He works the night shift at the dry docks." "Cray will know that too," Amal said, speeding up. "He has the Trust's resources. He'll track Gabriel down within the hour." "Why are we saving him?" Sarah cried. "If he dies, the money—" "There is no money if we're dead, Sarah," Amal snapped. Then his voice softened. "And Dad was right." "Right about what?" Flora asked. "About us," Amal said, gripping the wheel. "I saw the look in Cray's eyes. It's the same look Grandpa Sterling had in the old photos. Pure evil. I don't want to be that. I don't want to be a Sterling." He looked at Flora. "I want to be a Vance, like Dad. And Dad wanted to protect this kid." Flora felt a lump in her throat. "Then drive faster." They reached the Seattle shipyards in 20 minutes. It was a labyrinth of shipping containers and massive cranes, illuminated by harsh floodlights. "There," Flora pointed. "Dock 4. The employee roster said he's a welder." They abandoned the car and ran toward the dry dock. Sparks were flying from the hull of a massive tanker. A lone figure was suspended on a scaffold, welding a seam. "Gabriel!" Flora screamed, waving her arms. The figure stopped. He lifted his welding mask. Even from a distance, Flora gasped. He had Arthur's eyes. He had Arthur's jawline. He looked more like their father than Amal did. Gabriel Santos lowered the scaffold and jumped down. He was tall, wearing grease-stained coveralls. He looked at the 3 well-dressed, terrified strangers with confusion. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice deep and calm. "You're in danger," Flora said, breathless. "We need to get you out of here." "Who are you people?" Gabriel asked, stepping back. "I'm your sister," Flora said. Gabriel froze. What?" Before he could answer, a single shot rang out. Ping! A bullet struck the metal hull inches from Gabriel's head. "Get down!" Amal tackled Gabriel, driving him behind a stack of steel beams. Cray was walking down the length of the dock, calm and methodical. He had reloaded. "Very noble," Cray called out, his voice echoing off the metal containers. "But futile. Hand over the boy, Amal. You can still keep the company." Amal looked at Gabriel, this stranger, his brother, and then at Flora. "No deal," Amal yelled back. "Have it your way," Cray said. He raised the gun, aiming for the exposed gap in the steel beams where Flora was crouching. "No!" Gabriel shouted. He tried to move, but he was unarmed. Cray squeezed the trigger, but the shot never came. Instead, a blinding spotlight from above flooded the entire dock. The deafening thwop, thwop, thwop of a helicopter rotor drowned out the rain. "Drop the weapon!" A voice boomed from a loudspeaker. Cray looked up, blinded. From the shadows of the shipping containers, a dozen SWAT team members swarmed in, rifles raised. "Federal agents! Drop it!" Cray hesitated. For a second, he looked like he might shoot anyway. But then, a black sedan screeched onto the dock. Mr. Silas Thorne stepped out, flanked by 2 armed officers. "It's over, Cray," Thorne shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. "I sent the files to the FBI an hour ago. The Sterling Trust is frozen. Your employers are already in handcuffs." Cray lowered the gun. He smiled a cold, defeated smile. Arthur always was one step ahead. As the police tackled Cray, handcuffing him against the wet pavement, the adrenaline finally left Flora's body. She slumped against the cold steel of the container. Thorne walked over to them. The stoic lawyer looked at the 4 siblings, Flora, Amal, Sarah, and the confused Gabriel. "You cut it close, Miss Vance," Thorne said, a rare sparkle in his eye. "I was tracking your phone, but I needed you to find the boy. Arthur knew you were the only one stubborn enough to do it." Gabriel looked at Flora. "You're Arthur Vance's daughter?" "Yes," Flora said, reaching out to take his grease-stained hand. "And you're his son. You're our brother." Amal stood up, wiping mud from his suit. He looked at Gabriel, then extended a hand. "I'm Amal. Sorry about the tackle." Gabriel hesitated, then shook it. Gabriel. Sarah, shivering and missing a shoe, looked at the welder. "You better not be as annoying as Amal," she muttered, but there was no venom in it. Only relief. The rain finally stopped. Epilogue. 6 months later. The boardroom of Vance Global was full, but this time the atmosphere wasn't hostile. Gabriel sat at the head of the table. He wore a suit, but he looked uncomfortable in it. He preferred the site visits. "The motion carries," Gabriel said. "We're liquidating the Sterling assets to fund the new community housing project." Amal, sitting to his right as the chief operations officer, nodded. "It's a good move. The PR alone will triple our stock value." Amal had lost his arrogance, but he had kept his business brain. He was finally using it to build, not to destroy. Sarah was in charge of the Vance Foundation. She was still dramatic, but she was channeling that energy into fundraising galas that actually helped people. And Flora? Flora stood by the window, looking out at the city. She wasn't on the board. She didn't want a title. She had gone back to nursing school to finish her degree, funded by her share of the trust. Thorne walked up beside her. "Your father would be proud," Thorne said. "He knew," Flora smiled. "He knew we needed to break apart to come back together properly." "He left one last thing for you," Thorne said. He handed her a small envelope. Flora opened it. It was a photo of the 4 of them. Arthur, her mother, and a baby Flora, taken decades ago. On the back, in shaky handwriting, Arthur had written, "Family isn't blood. It's who you bleed for. Take care of them, Ellie." Flora looked at the table where Amal, Gabriel, and Sarah were laughing about something Gabriel had said. They weren't perfect. They were loud, messy, and complicated. But they were family. And for the first time in the history of the Vance name, they were truly rich. And that is how Flora Vance turned a moment of total defeat into the greatest victory of her life. She walked into that will reading a disowned outcast, and she walked out the matriarch of a new legacy. It proves that sometimes, when life strips everything away from you, it's only making room for something better. Arthur Vance's final lesson wasn't about money. It was about character. He knew that the only way to save his children from greed was to force them to rely on each other to survive. Thanks for watching this incredible story of betrayal, redemption, and justice. If you enjoyed this twist ending, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel. What would you have done if you were Flora? Would you have saved Amal and Sarah? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss our next story. See you in the next video.